Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, I hope you're ready to make a whole bunch of wolf tokens. Faldorn Dread Wolf Herald. What a card. Every time we play lands or cast stuff from exile, we make 2/2 wolves, and we can pitch a card from hand to impulse draw the top card of our deck. Faldorn leads legitimately one of the best pre-constructed commander decks I've ever seen. I once saw this deck right out of the box make over 14 wolf tokens in a single freaking turn. This deck is bomb. This commander is no joke. So let's see how we can upgrade her by grabbing her average deck list from EDHREC's average deck feature and importing that to the Archidect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps made to the deck must either remain cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the list. This deck really is dang near perfect. Like, for a while I wasn't even sure if I could make an Upping the Average video about this commander, because there's not that much that I want to change. Not only that, but it's also a pretty low price point too. On average in this series, we tend to see a deck starting budget be something like 250, 300, I don't know, but this is relatively low, so like this is a great deck to play on a budget. That definitely makes the swap-ins hard though, so we'll have to be clever about what we can switch into this deck. But before we get there, let's briefly cover Faldorn's core cards. And honestly, I'm just gonna fawn over this deck for a little bit. Like, I think we're all at least a little familiar with exile-based decks by this point, right? We've all seen commanders like Prosper Tomebound dominate that exile strategy space. Well, Faldorn is also totally wild and wonderful. She's cheap to cast, she fuels her own ability, and she spits out creature tokens like there's no tomorrow, and all for the simple act of using Red's impulse draw effects. So yeah, we're crafting an enormous board presence while accumulating card advantage. And there are so many wild and interesting ways to trigger the effect with things that technically cast from exile or set us up for exile casting, from Cascade to Adventures to Foretell. Oh, and some cards trigger when we activate Faldorn's discard effect too. So we're able to play the card that Faldorn impulse draws for us, and we're still able to play the card that we discarded from exile, which is just bomb. Plus, there are so many amazing payoffs for casting from exile nowadays, like doubling up our spells or dealing damage just for having cast them from such an unusual place. And oh my goodness, Tovolar is here, drawing us cards whenever we hit people with our wolf tokens. This is amazing. All we do is dig, and Faldorn gets us dogs. It's a fantastic arrangement, and one that swiftly takes over the entire battlefield. Beware, this is a very fiddly deck. So, how can we make it even spicier? Well, I've only got a few swaps to make, so let's get going. I think this commander kind of does that thing where you don't realize just how bonkers it is until you actually see it in action. Like, you read it, and at first glance, you're just like, I don't know, 2/2 wolves? I have to discard cards for that other ability? I don't know about it. And then you actually see someone play it, and you're like, oh. Yeah, Faldorn is just rad, and I hope these quick swaps will help make her even more fun for you. Overall, I adore this suite of creatures, and since this deck's on a tight budget, it's not like I can just say, hey, cut this thing that only costs a quarter and get a Dockside Extortionist in here, or anything like that. I did eventually find myself falling out of favor with 3 creatures in the deck though, and I'll tackle them all at once. Aurora Phoenix, Embereth Shieldbreaker, and the Mammoth. The Mammoth isn't a strong deterrent against removal, and mapping things out, that is 6 total mana with a delay to get a wolf token from Faldorn. Not horrible, but I just never felt like it was a particularly big contributor to the battlefield. Aurora Phoenix is also 6 mana, and while I do love that Cascade, I don't love this creature very much, even if it can come back to us later. A lot of our other Cascaders just feel better or are easier to cast. The Shieldbreaker 2 is 3 total mana to kill an artifact and get a wolf, plus this vanilla creature into play. It's a role filler, but it's not exciting. It took a while for me to figure out precisely why I wasn't loving these, and I think I can explain it best by showing you what I want to swap in exchange for them. More impulse draw effects. Rob the Archives and Inspired Tinkering are a smaller mana investment to find us even more cards, which means even more wolves, or other exile payoffs. Inspired Tinkering is one that I'm actually kind of surprised not to see in the deck list already. Flip 3 cards, make 3 treasure tokens? This card's great! Get set up for a big future turn, or set up that professional facebreaker in the main board for even greater success down the line? And Rob the Archives can casualty a wolf for it to happen twice? It has different timing restrictions than our other impulse effects, but that's still a lot of digging, and we're in green. We've got tokens and mana to spare. It feels weird to cut creatures for spells, but these spells also help produce bodies on the battlefield because of how many cards that they will provide to Faldorn, and they'll simultaneously find us even spicier things to keep fueling our engine, and that's why I'm so excited to get them in here. I'm definitely going to add in a creature too, though, and it's a little mad. Revolutionist has the Madness ability, which needs to be read very carefully. If it's discarded, it doesn't go right to the graveyard and we cast it from there. It goes into an exile zone, and then we can cast it from that exile zone. And hey, wouldn't you know it, Faldorn has a discard outlet right there. So Revolutionist can be cast technically from our hand, but technically not from our hand, and help us get wolves and get back some of our best spells, like, I don't know, Jessica's Will and Friends, and that will just really ruin people's day. Spell recursion is great, but the madness energy here is especially spicy. There are two other cards that I want to add in here, but in order to add, we must first cut. So let's browse once more. I'm overall really happy with the mana acceleration that this deck contains, although there is one stinker that I spy that came in the original precon, and just sadly kind of fails to deliver. Venture Forth is interesting, but it's not wonderful. It repeatedly suspends itself, which is awesome, but I don't know, it just feels like it takes a really, really long time for all that to come around, and I don't think this card is solving any problems or shoring up any weaknesses of this deck list. It's cool design, it's just a little slow for us when we're tuning things up. And I don't want to just examine the deck's mana advantage effects, I also want to examine its interaction. And on the whole, things are looking pretty great. There are some very good pinpoint removal spells, some clever board clearing effects in here, stuff that really synergizes with our exile strategy. But I do find myself lingering on that Mizium Mortars. I like that it's a versatile spell, but as one-sided board wipes go, I think Gruul can do better. In fact, I know it can. Listen, if we're gonna do 4 damage to everything we don't control, I mean, Izuri's Predation is only 35 cents right now, and this thing is a blowout. I think we deserve to make a butt-ton of tokens out of our board wipes. This deck goes super wide, so let's cater our removal to that strategy even more. And that leaves us with just one card left to add, but speaking of going wide, I think it makes sense for us to examine our win conditions again. We have damage dealers like the Passionate Archaeologist, which are phenomenal, and some cards like Warstorm Surge in there turn the mere act of creating all of those tokens into a truly devastating blow against our enemies. But I also noticed that we're playing budget MVP cards like Endray's Forerunners. And that makes total sense, because once again, I must state, this Faldorn deck will make so many tokens. It doesn't just flood the board, it monsoons the board. It Pacific Oceans the board. And yeah, when we have that many creatures in play, a simple pump will absolutely end the game. So this might not be super original, it might not be dazzling secret tech, but let's get a good old-fashioned overrun in here and turn all of our 2/2s into 5/5s that help us end the game. We don't have to get fancy. We just need to get to combat and swing. And that's it. Those are my swaps. Short, sweet, and to the point. But what if you're playing this deck on a slightly higher budget and you're looking to splurge on your Faldorn deck? What upgrades might you look out for then? Well, the world is your oyster, but let's start small. Anger is like $4 or $5 right now, and that's the first card that I would go for, because Faldorn can discard it and it will haste up our stuff for the rest of the game. If you want the classic green enchantments to pump up the deck's speed too, I can definitely see the appeal of those. I think Chandra is a great planeswalker to look for as well, netting us even more interesting impulse draw and giving us another angle of attack against our enemies. Plus, our wolves block for planeswalkers super dang well. If you want to make the wolves even more deadly upon their arrival, then Purphoros is another classic, and of course, Craterhoof will get things done in short fashion too. Since this deck really wants to keep its board intact, a Heroic Intervention also probably isn't a bad spot to look into. But then I'll take a left turn and say that if you want to get especially tricky, then Ubamask and Elkin Lair will definitely mess with people's draw steps and force them to play things from exile, which suits us way more than it suits our opponents. And notably, the highest budget versions of Faldorn decks often also contain an infinite food chain combo, exiling either the Eldrazi or Squee and then recasting it from exile over and over again, giving us infinite creature mana and also causing Faldorn to make infinite wolves. Combine that with any haste enabler and you've got yourself a game. Any one of these directions could be useful to look at for big upgrades, but none of them is a necessity. Play within your means, and if you want to get Faldorn some really awesome stuff, she'll really appreciate it. But if you want to keep the deck super budget, let me guarantee you, this deck still absolutely delivers. And that'll do it. Just a few quick tweaks to make an already awesome list just a little more consistent and a little more bombastic. You can find the link in the description below with the cuts and the maybe board. I hope you had a great time with the Dread Wolf Herald, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow Gruul Exile players, make sure you leave those suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.